Now, as for grief itself, we'll start with the basic, an easy working definition of grief. Grief is a normal response to any significant change which occurs in one's life situation. Pretty basic. A normal response to any significant change in one's life situation. We generally think about grief in relationship to death, and certainly it is connected to death, of course. But the issue of grief is actually much larger than just death. As I said, it's connected to any loss, to any change. Notice, did you hear that it is a normal response? We are hardwired to grieve. It is our natural and healthy way of making sense of loss and integrating loss into our lives. The word grieve comes from an old French word, graver, which means a heavy burden. And if you have had a grief experience, you probably resonate with that. Say, yes, absolutely, that's what it is. So grief can be uncomfortable, it can be painful, it can be a heavy burden, but it's also completely normal. There are, as you all know, many kinds of losses, many kinds of changes in our lives, and Ervilene is going to talk about those.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay. So as she said, many different types of losses, kinds of losses other than just by death. And some of those are moving. For many of you that came to ASU, you probably moved from home to here, maybe a different city. Or even just think about transitioning from high school to college. There's a lot of changes. And with those changes comes grief, loss, and grief. Perhaps you left a pet behind. Friends change. You lost your laundry service. Maybe had to quit a job to come here, a job that you liked. All of those are losses. There may be loss of dreams. Perhaps you didn't get a job that you really wanted, or in high school didn't get on the drill or dance team, or even here at ASU. Or another one, didn't get accepted to your first choice of colleges. That's another type of loss of dreams or hopes that you have. There's many different kinds of relationships, and often loss of a relationship can be very significant. Perhaps breaking up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or your best friend is no longer in your life. Divorce is another one. It can be divorce of parents, and that can have many losses, kind of even a ripple effect, if you will. But you know, divorce even experienced by maybe a sibling or an aunt or an uncle, in which the ex is no longer a part of the family, but you really liked them, you really connected with them. It's difficult sometimes to maintain that relationship, and so that may be another loss. As I mentioned earlier, saying goodbye to high school or to friends or activities that you were involved in or familiar routines. Physical losses oftentimes are significant. Maybe injuries that affect your participation in sports of any kind. Maybe other physical losses that people can't see, which brings us to silent losses. And those are losses that aren't talked about. Perhaps an abortion, or giving up an addiction, maybe even loss of childhood as a result of physical or sexual abuse. And so finally, we come to loss by death. And even within that, there are many different kinds of losses by death. Some may be expected, like a result of age or chronic illness that you see coming, cancer, perhaps other significant health issues. It may be sudden, a death that is quick or unexpected, perhaps a heart attack, a stroke, a car accident, a drowning. And then I happened to think of all the people in Alabama affected by the tornado and the deaths there. They had no idea, like the day before, that they wouldn't see their loved one again. And with that, sometimes it can be traumatic. A tragic accident, perhaps a murder. Maybe it's an accident that you were involved in or even witnessed. Those can be traumatic losses. And suicide, very often, very tragic, very traumatic. It's unexpected, it's traumatic, and one of the most difficult losses to grieve. There can also be death of a spouse or child, a parent, a grandparent, friends, and or classmates. So just as there are many different types of losses, there's also different types of grief as well. And within that, everybody does grief differently. There's no really one way to grieve. There's really no right or wrong way to do it. So with that said, let's kind of talk about normal grief. It has a broad range of symptoms and reactions, and yet there's an ability to function on some level while doing the difficult grief work and moving towards acceptance. Another type of grief is anticipatory grief, just as kind of the name says. It's a loss that you know is coming, might be by death, or as I mentioned earlier, moving has a lot of losses. It doesn't really mean that it makes the death easier or the loss easier. However, it does give you the opportunity to treasure the time that you have left, perhaps making it more meaningful. And we hear from our families often how nice it was to have the opportunity to say goodbye. Because not having that opportunity sometimes really complicates things, which there is complicated grief, which has more than the usual number of circumstances, usually causes more of a challenge in daily functioning, and can be longer lasting. Delayed grief. That's a grief in which the loss is really not experienced until later than usual for the type of loss that occurred. And sometimes that just kind of happens naturally, I guess. Oftentimes with sudden, unexpected losses, I think there's a period of time where there's shock and not really believing that it happened. And so in some ways that can delay the grief until the reality begins to sink in. Gradually, kind of slowly, you have those reality checks, I call it, where somebody may call for your loved one and you think, oh, wait, they're not here. Cumulative grief is when you have one loss after another, and they just seem to keep happening, and you don't get to recover from one when there's another. I mentioned earlier traumatic losses. There's traumatic grief as a result of the traumatic losses, or it can be when death that it is experienced is frightening, unexpected, maybe it was violent, and it can also, traumatic grief is often a response to the death by suicide. Collective grief is felt by a community or a nation, and it can be a result of a natural disaster. It can be a terrorist attack. You think of 9/11, the whole nation experienced that grief. It might be a student death in which the whole campus community feels that. When I was a senior in college, a classmate of mine who had graduated a year earlier was working in the community, and he was electrocuted. He survived, but he had both arms, both hands, and both feet amputated. Well, they met with the campus students the morning after that accident. And I can still remember the feel of the community that morning. But how grateful we all were that they met with us and they gave us the details. They told us what happened, they told us how he was doing, and how helpful that was in our own grief process. Disenfranchised grief is a grief that really isn't acknowledged by others. It's not talked about or it's minimized. And that might be the result of a miscarriage, perhaps an abortion. It can be a breakup in a relationship where your friends and family are really glad that that relationship ended because they didn't like that ex anyway. You know, and so they talk about, boy, it's about time you did that. And you're hurting and you're grieving. Who do you talk to about that? Well, you know, if you go to talk to them, there's not going to be a whole lot of empathy for that. And they're going to tell you, get a grip and see the real person. Perhaps leaving home to come to college may have been very hard and a very different experience for you, where everybody else is so excited to get away from mom and dad and to be independent. I can do what I want when I want now, and I don't have to tell them everything or hide everything from them. But your experience might be different from that. And lastly, there's carried grief, which is also known as unresolved grief. And that's when the choice is made not to grieve. Or you think you've done all the grieving, but really haven't. I've talked about it some. And so I like the term carried grief versus unresolved grief. So now we'll talk about some of the symptoms
Yes.
of all these griefs.
Before we get to symptoms, I'd like to address a huge myth about grief. That huge myth continues to shape our understandings of grief in the United States. Anybody here ever heard of the 5 stages of grief? Or perhaps the need to let go, move on, get closure? That perspective comes from Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She is probably the seminal person in shaping beliefs about grief in the United States. She did phenomenal work. Her work was in the 1960s. Think for a minute about how many things have changed since the 1960s. You know, our phones are different, our treatments for cancer are different, social media is different. Most things in our lives are different. And just as we have learned new ways of understanding technology, we now understand our bodies and brains differently than we did in the 1960s. And so we have new understandings of the grief process. But regrettably, we like the 5-stage theory. The 5-stage theory is easy. It's easy to remember. It's easy to tell other people how to do it. But it's not actually accurate for most of us. For the few people that it works for, lucky for them. But for the rest of us, grief tends to be much more messy and roller coaster-esque than a linear 5-stage process. Of course, part of the problem is that the 5-stage theory continues to be taught in medical schools, in counseling programs, in colleges, in seminaries, at churches. Just recently I was talking to a nurse and she said they had just learned the 5-stage theory in their nursing class. So you all now are ambassadors of truth about grief. When you hear somebody talk about that. Say we understand grief a little bit differently now. So instead of it being an easy 5-stage process, we're going to talk about some of the symptoms of grief. So we all think about the emotional symptoms or expressions of grief. For instance, crying, feeling sad, being angry, longing for the one we loved or the life that we had. Have you ever heard the phrase, "it's all in your head"? That is not usually meant as a compliment. And it's certainly, when people say that to you, they don't mean to be said, or they usually aren't saying, what a good job you're doing with your grief. But actually, it is a very accurate description of what's going on when you're grieving. There is a lot that goes on in our brains when we're grieving that really screws up so much of the rest of us. Our brain literally changes when we are grieving. So for instance, our ability to concentrate is impacted because our brain is working differently. Or as some would say, because our brain isn't actually working very well. We get distracted easily. We can't remember things as well. Our eyesight and allergies can be impacted. Our digestive system gets screwed up. Our immune system is compromised, which means we much more easily get colds, flu, pneumonia, stomach bugs, even more serious diseases. Our coordination is even messed up. Did you have any idea that grief can cause you to be clumsy? Isn't that wild? An example, a few years ago, my husband was dealing with a significant loss, and he's a bicycle rider. And he kept hitting potholes and falling off his bike. He finally had to realize he could not ride his bicycle while he was grieving because he's so distracted, he wasn't seeing the potholes, and because he didn't have good coordination when he started to fall, he couldn't stop himself. So for his own health's sake, he needed to stop riding his bicycle. When we're grieving, our senses are more sensitive. For instance, we have less tolerance for noise. So for instance, music that you might have always loved now makes you crazy. Or perhaps you really enjoyed getting together with friends, and now it's like just too much stimulation. Perhaps good friends or apartment mates or family members irritate the crud out of you, and you have no idea why. It's just like all of a sudden everything they do makes you crazy. That is all normal. CRH is a hormone that produces anxiety-like symptoms. That hormone increases when we are grieving. It is, and when that increases, it is like emergency mobilizing chemicals course through our body. So as our stress increases, the chemical levels increase, which of course creates more stress to increase, and the cycle keeps going. And well-meaning people are saying, oh, you should be better by now, or you should just get closure, or it'll be okay, just let go. And your body is a hot mess, basically. There is a reason why people feel like they're going crazy when they're grieving. A huge issue with grief is a feeling of lack of control. I mean, your life has changed. The rug's been pulled out from under you. And so you're not feeling very in control, and then your body and mind are not cooperating very well. And so You would love to let it go. You would love to move on. You would love to be better, and instead you just feel crazy. That's normal grief. Now notice on the handout all the other symptoms. Grief can impact our soul, can cause us to question what we believe or don't believe. It can cause all kinds of things that happen in us. One thing that really surprises people is how tired we are when we're grieving. I mean, and you can imagine if all these various things are going on inside of you, a lot of times all at the same time, our energy is going to the grief process. So we don't have as much energy to do what we were doing before. We don't have as much energy to be with other people. I mean, we're pretty good doing the basics of the day. People are so surprised that they take naps when they've never taken naps, or and our sleep is often disrupted as well. So all that combines together for us to then need more rest when we're grieving. Okay. Now, a normal part of grief is depression. And sometimes it can be hard to differentiate between sadness or the normal depression due to grief, or depression that needs to be addressed with intervention, medication, or something else. And sometimes well-meaning people or ourselves, and I hear it at least every week, you probably do too, and when I'm talking with somebody, should I go on an antidepressant? I think maybe that would help me with my grief. Well, the only way to do grief is to do grief. The only way to heal from grief is to do the grief work. So if you're grieving, an antidepressant is not going to take the grief away. It's not going to do the work for you. However, if you have moved into clinical depression, then medication may absolutely be helpful. It will not take the grief away, but it may help you shift so that you actually can do the grief work. Does that make sense? So we also have a handout that's very handy, differences between grief and depression. And there are certainly times in working with people that I say, you know, it sounds like what's going on is normal, appropriate grief. I don't think, in my opinion, you need medication. And I'll tell you, doctors are very quick to say to their patients, oh my goodness, your loved one died 6 weeks ago, maybe you should go on an antidepressant. Because, of course, doctors are in the business of wanting to help and fix people. And medication is a tool that they have to do that. And so they'll come in and they'll say, my doctor said maybe I should try an antidepressant. And I'll say, well, you know, it sounds to me like what you're doing is normal, healthy grief work. And there certainly are other times when I say to somebody, I think we need to talk about medication intervention as well as grief counseling.
So let's take a look at, why does everybody do it differently? Why do no two people ever grieve the same way? Well, each of you are unique, and you've experienced life uniquely. Some of the factors that are involved are your personality. Are you introverted or extroverted? What is your way of coping or perhaps not coping with stress? What types of losses have you had, at what ages, and were they sudden, expected, traumatic? How did your parents grieve, or friends or loved ones that you were around grieve? What religious or cultural beliefs or experiences have you had with death or significant losses? The type of relationship. Was it a parent, a grandparent, a friend, a classmate, a pet? How close or dependent or intimate or private or secretive was the relationship? The type of loss in the attachment to the deceased really influences the intensity and duration of the grief. We've mentioned loss of a pet, and for many people that's their first really significant loss. And it may be as a child, it may be as an older adult. Other factors, what were the circumstances? Are there any feelings of guilt or unfinished business? Did you get to say goodbye? As I mentioned earlier, that opportunity can be so important. Your age, the expectations you might have of yourself or that others have of you, kind of depending on where you're at in your life. And with that, I would like to take a look at what makes it difficult to cope with grief during the college years. Well, there's so much academic pressure at a time when your brain isn't functioning adequately. Like Karen said, your brain changes. Your concentration isn't there. You can attend a lecture, you can take notes, and you can look at those notes later and go, what the heck? Yeah. Perhaps you're away from home for the first time. And with that, you might be too far away from home to go home as often as you would like. Well, you might be trying to be independent from your parents at a time when you need their support or the support of that community that you grew up in. I think another one is college is supposed to be the best 4 years of your life. Why am I having to struggle with this loss now? Friends and faculty might be unknowingly insensitive, and as Karen said, tell you just get a grip. Move on. Get over it. Just let it go. Or I think another one is many of your friends or peers may not have experienced the type of loss that you've experienced. I've talked with college-age students who have lost a parent, and many of their friends have not. And while their friends are trying to be understanding, it's very difficult. And I'm sure Karen's heard it too. Until you've experienced, do you understand? And even that understanding may be limited because the relationship is different. Yeah. And so what happens if you're grieving a significant loss in college? Well, often there's a decline in academic performance. You get tired, you start missing class, and your grades begin to sink. There might be an onset or increase in social anxiety, so you withdraw and isolate. There might be an inability to sleep or an increase in sleeping. Sometimes people do that as a way of avoiding all that grief, all that heaviness, all that yuck. Some people keep going back over and over and over the loss. How it occurred, where I was, who told me. Can even remember what they were wearing that day. The details are so there. And so that's hard to concentrate when you've got that going on, or sleep. So there's a lot of restlessness, a lot of anxiety. And when you don't get enough sleep, or even an increase in sleep, can cause a decrease in energy or motivation or initiative, resulting in depression, as Karen stated. And so you get there and you think, how do I get out of this? What do I do now? Never thought I would be depressed. How do I get out of it? Well, I think one of the things is to share your feelings with a friend or friends or someone who hopefully understands it or gets it, as we say. Sometimes just talking about your loved one or the loss that you've experienced is helpful. The type of person they were, some of the memories that you have with them. Another important one is to pace yourself. Grief is hard work. It's very tiring. And at the end of the day, you may think, I haven't done anything, but I'm exhausted. Grief is hard work. And so it takes a lot of energy to feel so intensely. And so allow yourself plenty of time to do just the normal everyday activities, because it's going to take you longer. To get up, to get a shower, to get dressed, to get ready for class. Getting up is the hardest thing. Rest when you can and when you need to. Maybe just a power nap. Try not to overschedule yourself. You know, somebody says, hey, why don't you go so-and-so with us? Oh, okay. And then you come on, oh gosh, now I've got to do X, Y, or Z. Or can you help us out with? Sure. And then you realize, I don't have the energy for that. I don't have the motivation for that. Sometimes just saying, let me think about it. Or give me a minute, let me think about this. Express your grief. As I said, talking about it. But another best thing to do with it is let it out. You can cry, you can scream, you can yell, you can talk. Sometimes expressing it through music or art or poetry or journaling. You know, one of the things that I often encourage people to do is like, I just wish I could scream. I said, get in your car and drive and scream. Put the windows down if you want to. Let people look at you. It's okay, you know. If it's windy, it won't be, nobody's going to hear it anyway. Another one is to work out, exercise. Research really shows that exercise can help you retain information. Reading that, I thought, boy, I better get busy. I'm going to start exercising a lot. But it does increase the endorphins and relieve stress. And you guys really have an awesome gym here, or the CHP, I think you call it. You can go alone, and you're going to be around others. It's open, it's inviting, it's stimulating. If you go on the right time of day, on the right day, you're going to see me upstairs riding one of the bicycles and reading. It's a great time for me to read. Another one, be patient. There's going to be good days. There's going to be bad days. You're not going to simply get over it. It can't all be done at once. And I love this analogy. Do it in regular doses like you would medicine. What have you all heard about antibiotics? If you take them all at once, it's not going to be effective. If you stop them before you finish them, even though the symptoms have gone away, what's going to happen? The symptoms are likely to come back. How often do you hear, be sure you take all of them? Well, grief work is the same thing. It's a continuing thing. It's not as hard all the time, but it's important to keep at it and to be patient with yourself and with others, really. I think another helpful thing is staying connected in some way to your loved one. What do I mean by that? Some people wear an item of jewelry. Some people carry something in their pocket. Some have a favorite shirt they wear if they're feeling down. You go put that shirt on. Some have a special shirt made for that. I've seen window decals in memory of. You know, you want to guess one of the more common, maybe, I don't know if it's popular ways now for people to stay connected? Thank you. I was expecting somebody from the crowd. Tattoos. Yeah. Very common. Very common. Be compassionate. Appreciate yourself and your accomplishments, no matter how small. If it's getting out of bed, getting a shower, and getting to class almost on time, congratulate yourself. Another biggie is to reduce or eliminate alcohol and not to do illegal drugs. If the urge is there, instead take a time out and do something fun. Perhaps a fun, cheap activity. Be creative. Think of something. And I would say another very important one is to consider talking to a counselor, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed or hopeless or helpless, or if you're having suicidal thoughts. It's amazing. People will come in to see us and they say, I don't exactly know what to say, and I'll ask one question and they start talking and they talk nonstop. And then they'll say, whew, I feel better, you know. And I haven't said probably 5 words, you know.
Yeah.
It's just that opportunity. Somebody's willing to listen. Somebody can listen. And that doesn't happen in every friend. It's just too difficult. And families are sometimes the worst people to try to listen. It's too difficult for families to hear. And so I say to them, there's a lot of power in the spoken word. When you can say it out loud, it doesn't feel or look near as big as it did inside. And when it's all inside, guess what? It's going to leak out sideways if you don't talk about it. You're going to get mad, you're going to get irritable, you're going to have road rage. Oof. I hope I'm not around, but yeah. Or you're just going to go, to heck with it all. And college isn't a time to do that. So, I guess because I am a counselor, I strongly ask you to consider talking to a counselor. And as Karen said, we are available. We've brought business cards. If you want to give us a call, there's no charge. There's the counseling center and counselors available there as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.